Though this is the last episode of the History Blokes, do not despair. We'll soon be dropping 2 eps featuring highlights from the series.
Welcome back, listeners, to the final episode of the History Blokes, the podcast where we cover strange stories, interesting facts, and fascinating people from Australia's past that we think you ought to know about. I'm Chris McComb.
I'm Conan.
And we're coming to you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. And Conan, we've made it. Got to our last episode.
Yeah, we got there. The marathon is over.
14 months we've been doing this, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, December 22. And yeah, it's been a blast.
It really has.
Yeah.
It really has, for sure. No, it's been a wonderful journey of ups and downs and roundabouts.
Yes. And we're ending on a bit of a downer, Chris. You would think, really, that we should have ended on some kind of celebratory topic. But today I want to talk about the smallpox epidemic that hit Sydney's Aboriginal population the year after the first fleet arrived. It's one of those events that signalled the beginning, of course, of the devastation of Australia's First Nations people. And the causes of it are quite interesting, particularly as they are somewhat unknown. So we'll be delving into that. But first, Chris,
we're going to go to a quiz.
We're going to go to a quiz, and not just any quiz. I cackled with glee as I put this together last night, Chris, because I've gone through previous episodes and found questions.
Don't.
Questions you got wrong.
I'm gonna. I have a memory like a goldfish. Yeah. I'm going to get them wrong again.
Yeah,
just to make a point.
That's the hope. That's the great hope. But also, it's a nice way to summarise the series.
Wonderful. I look forward to answering your questions yet again, Conan, for the last time.
Question 1. On what date did the first fleet make landfall on the east coast of Australia?
You're an absolute bastard. I don't know. 2 weeks before Australia Day.
Nope, the 18th of January.
I was close.
So that's, of course, when they arrived in...
Botany Bay, absolutely.
Yes. Okay, what is New Zealand's National Day? I don't expect you to get the date.
Why Tangi Day?
Yeah.
That's the treaty with the Maoris, of course.
Yes. And what year was that in? We covered that last week.
1836.
No, 1840.
1840.
And Waitangi Day is 6th of February. Why are carrots the colour they are?
Because they were bred specifically that colour by the Dutch.
Why?
Because Dutch like the colour orange very much.
Well, it was a tribute to William of Orange,
of course,
who led the struggle for Dutch independence from the Spaniards in the mid-17th century.
A lot of people don't realise the Dutch were under the yoke of the Spanish for some time.
Yeah, and the town of Orange is named after William II, who came from the Orange-Nassau dynasty.
I do remember that, and I always thought that was such a fascinating fact.
Yeah. So, people probably driven through Orange and loosely wondered why it's called that. There doesn't seem to be an abundance of citrus trees around. It's because a number of towns in central New South Wales are named after generals who took part in the Battle of Waterloo. So you have Wellington, and you have Maitland, who was a general, and you have Orange, because William II fought there.
That's brilliant. Having heard that the second time, still think that's a great fact.
Yes. This one I'm going to enjoy asking you, particularly if you get it wrong. Now, question 4. Who was the first person to break the sound barrier and when?
Chuck Yeager?
Yes.
1950. No. 1961.
Oh.
Damn it. 48.
47.
God. 47.
Oh, dear me.
This is terrible.
How many times that's the third time I've asked you this.
I know.
That's lovely asking the questions. Question 5. Marie Curie discovered what 2 elements?
Radium and cesium.
Nope.
God damn it. What?
Polonium. And she named it after...
Did I get the first one right?
Yes.
At least, thank
it was radium, yeah.
Polonium.
I think you got that correct before. She named it after what country?
Poland?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Why would she name it after Poland?
She's Polish?
Yeah, exactly. And she was the first woman to win 2 Nobel Prizes in different categories.
Well, yeah, I know. And she also died of exposure to radiological elements.
As
well.
did her daughter, who was also working on X-rays and whatnot. Her daughter also won a Nobel Prize, I believe.
Oh,
yeah.
Also won a Nobel Prize.
Yeah,
I thought you were about to say she died. Didn't learn from
No,
her mother.
both.
Oh, and then died as well.
Yeah.
Jeez.
And her daughter, in turn, became a nuclear physicist or whatever, but is still alive and is in the, 80s or something, 90s.
Wow.
So she has learned.
Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to be a trendsetter in nuclear science, unfortunately.
Yeah, and collectively the Curies have won 5 Nobel Prizes. So they are the family that has won the most Nobel Prizes in history. They are.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And you know what? I find that particular series of facts really curious.
So I'll be editing that one out. Question 6. What is a florin?
Florin is, as in what's its value? What's its value?
Well, in old money, it's another word for
10 pence.
2 shillings.
God.
Yeah.
Okay, let's keep going.
Uh-huh.
This is horrible. I hate this. This is horrible.
And that's
mean.
I know it is mean. It's sadistic, is what it is.
I would have swatted up, if I'd known this was coming.
Yeah, but that's why I didn't tell you. Question 7. My dog Charlie is a Groodle, half golden retriever, half poodle, half bath mat. So he's roughly the size of golden retriever. His brain is the size of what kind of fruit?
A blueberry.
I often think that would be...
Only because I've seen Charlie. Only because I've observed...
Well, he hasn't got smarter since you last saw him.
That's right.
Still an idiot. Particularly when you put him next to our German Shepherd, who seems to... Like, you can look into Frankie's eyes, the German Shepherd's eyes, and you see sentience. You get the sense that there is a reasonably intelligent animal. You look into Charlie's dull, listless gaze, and you just think, you useless, pointless, inbred muppet.
I'm going to say grape.
It's in Mandarin. Speaking of pets, what was the name of Matthew Flinders' cat? It's a legitimately hard one. I can't remember. No, I don't. No.
Sir Lancelot? Something like that, isn't it?
Trim. Yeah.
Trim the cat.
That's a bastard question.
It is a bastard question.
So, final question. Speaking of cats, what are the 4 species of proper big cat? And what can they do that other big cats, such as cougars and cheetahs and stuff?
Lion.
Yep.
Tiger. Cheetah.
No.
How now? You said big cat.
The 4 proper big cats.
Oh, okay, fine. Lion.
And they can do something that other big cats, like cougars and cheetahs, can't do.
Which is the retracting of the claws thing, isn't it?
Oh, I hadn't thought of that. That wasn't what I was thinking.
Okay. Panther?
No.
Oh, God.
You got that last time.
Oh, damn it.
So lion, tiger...
Yeah, I got that. Lion, tiger... Yeah.
Spots. Trees.
Leopard.
Yep.
There's the South American one. Okay, go on. Jaguar.
So the thing that they can do that other cats can't do is roar. Oh, I can't pronounce it. Roar.
Is what? Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Roar. They can roar. And they can also breed with each other because they're of the same genus, which is Panthera.
Which is why you got ligers and so on. Okay, and that makes sense.
Yeah, and you can get jaguleps.
Jeepers creepers.
Lion, jaguars, and leopards bred together.
Just for like around the house.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to the quiz at intermission.
Oh yeah, no, yeah. I deserve it. I hope it's really hard. Poetic justice. Okay, there's a bit of levity.
Indeed.
To open things up.
So, let's get into the story.
Now, let's talk a little bit about smallpox. It is, without doubt, one of the most virulent and unpleasant diseases to have afflicted humans. It's infected hundreds of millions of people throughout history and killed large numbers of them. And those who survived often ended up disfigured, blind, or both. So, it's a virus. It's thought to have originated thousands of years ago in the Middle East or China. It devastated Rome in the 2nd century CE, but it didn't really become prevalent in Europe until the 16th century. I assume you don't know why it's called smallpox?
I presume it's because it has very, very little small marks on your body.
Well, that's a reasonable guess, but it's actually to distinguish it from what was called the great pox, which was syphilis.
Is that right?
Yeah. It remains contagious for about 2 weeks while the sufferer develops fever, aches, rashes, and festering pustules, and these are really unpleasant. So I don't suggest you Google this, but the images online of patients who are just simply covered in these pustules all over their bodies, even the inside of their mouths. And these are unbearably uncomfortable. Eventually they burst and produce a sort of foul-smelling pus.
Incredibly nasty.
Yeah, and then that scabs over.
Yep.
Incredibly itchy and unpleasant. And it's not until those scabs come off, assuming you've lived that long, can you determine whether or not the person has been horribly scarred. So it can completely disfigure your face. The mortality rates for adults are generally around 50%. And obviously it affects children and pregnant women much more. So of the 50% who survive, there's also a decent chance, as I say, you'll go blind or be disfigured. So to come out of it unscathed is reasonably unlikely. Queen Elizabeth I got it, came through unscathed, but her lady-in-waiting who was looking after her contracted it and was hideously disfigured. So until the introduction of vaccination in the late 18th century, it killed 400,000 people a year in Europe.
Yeah, it's huge, isn't it?
So no other disease has killed anything like that many people. So it's appalling. Over the course of the centuries, Europeans were still prone to it, but they had developed a degree of immunity so that it meant that it didn't sort of wipe out the whole of Europe. However, that, of course, was not true of Aboriginal people in Sydney when European colonists arrived in 1788, of course. Now, it broke out in April 1789. And the thing about it is that we don't know how it broke out amongst the Aboriginal population. There wasn't a lot of interaction, certainly in those early stages, between Aboriginal people and white people. And they can't have contracted it directly off Europeans because no one arrived in Sydney with smallpox. And as I said, it's only contagious for about 2 weeks after you get it. So obviously people had various diseases as they arrived, but smallpox wasn't one of them. So therefore, how did they get it? That's the question.
Animals? I mean, that's how, obviously, I suspect that's how people got smallpox originally.
Yeah, that's
I wonder
a good
if it
point.
was livestock and so on.
Yeah, I'm not aware that you can get smallpox from livestock. That's not one of the theories. That there is a reasonable possibility that they contracted it from what's called variolous matter. Now that is a primitive form of inoculation that the doctors on the First Fleet brought over. And basically what they are is just pustules that have been removed from the skin of recovering smallpox patients.
Okay, so it's the live virus, effectively.
Yes, yes.
And small quantities.
Yeah, and that would be stored in vials of some kind, and then that's used as a primitive form, as a sort of inoculation. It would be used for any children born in the colony. The thing about variolous matter is that there's a reasonable chance that you will develop full-blown smallpox from it.
And die from the vaccination.
And die from the vaccination.
The early vaccinations were like that, don't they? If I remember from some of our earlier episodes.
Well, yes. I mean, the vaccination, we will talk a little bit about the proper vaccination, which came a bit later, or around the same time. And that was much safer. But what was called variolation, introducing pustules into an open wound as a primitive form of inoculation, was dangerous. But on balance, it was considered to be a better bet than running the risk of contracting smallpox. It was so widespread that there's a decent chance you're going to be exposed to smallpox, so it's better to run the risk. But still, obviously, not a great solution. Anyway, they brought the variolous matter over, these sort of disgusting pustules and glass vials. So that is certainly a conceivable way in which the Aboriginal people would have been exposed to the smallpox virus. But how did they get exposed to the variolous matter? Well, we don't know. But there is some suggestions that it was deliberately introduced to the Aboriginal people by officers of the First Fleet. Probably not Governor Phillip, because he was quite personally well disposed towards Aboriginal people, and he was under orders to treat them well. But it's possible that some of his officers would have taken matters into their own hands. They would have felt outnumbered. There were only, a few hundred Marines, and they were surrounded by Aboriginal people whom they held in contempt, of course. Importantly, they knew that smallpox could be used as a form of biological warfare. It had been used against Native Americans.
South America wiped out 90% of the population, not just smallpox, but that combination of diseases.
Yes, yeah. Although I think in many cases in South America it wasn't deliberate, but I think the British.
But it makes the case though for using it.
Yeah, but the British deliberately did it
Yeah.
in North America, and they knew it worked.
Wow, God.
And so
Horrendous.
many of these officers would have known that, so they might have just seen introducing smallpox as a solution to what they perceived to be a problem. Now, that's one distinct possibility. And also, it might have been done by convicts. It might not have been done by officers. We don't know. I mean, we actually simply don't know. It's also been argued that it originated with the Macassars. Do you know who they were?
No.
So they came from present-day Indonesia, and they'd been trading with Aboriginal people in Arnhem Land and elsewhere in northern Australia for a few centuries prior to that. It's possible that they might have introduced various diseases to Aboriginal people up there, but it's not really possible that smallpox could have travelled from northern Australia down to Sydney, because it would have to travel astonishing distances across inhospitable terrain occupied by very small numbers of people. And the thing about smallpox is that it needs high population density to thrive. And it would never have found that.
It would have just petered out.
Yes.
You know, given the low density of Australia at the time.
Because there were only about 300,000 Aboriginal people living in Australia at the time. And it's also been suggested that the disease was not smallpox at all, but chickenpox, which the European colonists might have inadvertently passed on.
And yet can be equally deadly, I suppose. Yeah, particularly for those that have no immunity at all,
So whereas smallpox has a 2-week incubation period, as I said, chickenpox can remain dormant in someone from childhood and manifest itself later as shingles, a disorder from which it's likely that some colonists suffered. So the ulcers produced by shingles contain the chickenpox virus. Get your shingles vaccination. That's my suggestion. I've got mine.
Oh, I mean, I've got...
Not because it passes on chickenpox, but because it's very unpleasant.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I'm fairly sure I've got all my vaccinations for everything, but I'm going to go and check them now.
I think
after this episode.
It's advised for people over. I know you're not quite 50, but for people over 50, but you have to pay. It's like 2 shots, $500. So
really,
you might be able to get it back on your health fund. But however, it's also been argued that because smallpox was extremely common in England, it is unlikely the 5 doctors that were among the first fleet would have confused the two diseases, because they were observing Aboriginal people who were dying from the disease, and they would be very familiar with smallpox. And our reports from that time were that the Aboriginal people were dying from that disease, not chickenpox. So the chickenpox theory is unlikely, just as the Macassar theory is fairly unlikely. It's much more likely that they contracted it from the variolous matter, and as I say, how else could they have got hold of that unless they were deliberately exposed?
And the variolous matter was absolutely brought to Australia.
Yes.
They've got records of that, So kind of, it is a bit, unfortunately, horribly suspicious.
It is, so assuming it was smallpox, colonists found cases of the disease as far north as the Hawkesbury River and as far south as Botany Bay. We don't know how many Aboriginal people died, not least because we don't know the population of the broader Sydney area at the time. But colonists at the time estimated that as many as 70% of the Aboriginal population, the Sydney region, died from the disease. This is what William Bradley, a Royal Navy officer and cartographer, said. "We did not see a canoe or a native the whole way coming up the harbour, and were told that scarce any had been seen lately, except laying dead in and about their habitations." So this would have been in 1789. And the effect of all of this was that it led to some Aboriginal people leaving the Sydney area, which had at least 2 effects. One, it may have spread the disease further inland. And second, it reduced the number of Aboriginal people who were able to resist European colonisation. So if it was introduced deliberately to reduce the threat posed by Aboriginal people, it worked. But unfortunately, what it means is that we might have to consider the very distinct possibility that one of the first things European colonists did when they arrived in Australia was an act of genocide. Something to think about.
Yeah, no, it's all very horrible. Conan?
Well, on that very unpleasant note, let's head into the intermission.
Now we'll move from that downer to another downer for our intermission. We'll just have a bit of a discussion around 2 of perhaps the great plagues that wiped out huge proportions of the planet's human population at the time. I'm going to talk firstly about the Black Death, which we're all familiar with, of course. And so during the 14th century, the Black Death killed around a third of the population of Europe. So that's 25 million people. Wow. So when we sit around, as we have in the recent past, talking about the very, very high affliction rate of COVID-19, for example, it's kind of nothing compared to what we've experienced in the past, certainly, in medieval times and so on. The plague was where people first developed the concept of quarantine. And do you know what quarantine comes from, Conan?
Ooh. No. Oh, when are you going to quiz me?
I'd like to quiz you, but unfortunately I didn't construct my spiel in terms of quiz questions. Oh. So I'm just going to quiz you as we move through.
Oh, fine. Quarantine. Is it Latin? Something Latin for something?
Getting close.
Getting close?
Okay.
What does that mean? Look, Italian?
Indeed. Quarantina actually means 40 days. It's part of the Venetian language, so I'll give you some points. It came about in the 14th and 15th century, but also this concept of keeping people on a ship or on a small neighbouring island for 40 days to clear them before they enter the city or cross over onto the mainland sort of goes back to those times. And for some reason, 40 days, it seems very biblically connected in my mind.
Yeah.
And of course, we've been quarantining people ever since those days. A lot of people today don't realise that the plague is still in existence. Yeah. Of course, this isn't a medieval disease, of course. It actually remains endemic in countries like Madagascar and the Congo, and would you believe Peru as well. And of course, the prevailing theory for how plague reached Europe is...
I don't know, from Asia, from India, maybe?
Fleas carried on rats, ships, so trade. I suspected you were going there. Although there are new theories that suggest it was human body lice and even infected grain. And of course, we all know the old nursery rhyme associated with the plague, ring-a-ring-a-rosy. So plague was associated with a rosy rash as a symptom of the plague, and of course, a pocket full of posies. And posies of herbs were carried as protection to ward off the smell of the disease. And as we remember, the word for disease carried through the air...
Miasma theory?
That's very good. And you might recall those classic get-ups that medical practitioners, quacks if you like, used at the time with those kind of bird-like faces with a very, very long nose, which had herbs stuffed into the front end of it to avoid them acquiring the plague through the air. So the plague was bad, right? But the Spanish flu was even worse. Yeah. So the Spanish flu really kicked off in around 1918 and ran through just for a couple of years to 1919, really straddling the end of the Great War.
And it was due to the First World War, wasn't it? Because all those men pressed together in the trenches and then bring it back to their respective countries.
100%. Look, the Spanish flu occurred regardless, obviously, but it was about the size and the magnitude of its impact was driven by a variety of factors. Some of the key elements was holding information regarding the spread of the flu, particularly in those countries involved in the war. It was a novel virus, so there was no herd immunity at all. Interestingly, they had a series of 5 or 6 particularly wet years at that time. So it was a sort of a climate anomaly, if you like, which led to more humid conditions in many of those areas, and therefore the virus was able to spread more effectively. Cramped conditions of soldiers, movement of people, and of course, at the end of the war, what does everyone do? They all gather together in enormous crowds, so they create these mass spreading events where it was absolutely able to take off. More people died of influenza in a single year than in 4 years of the Black Death. From 1347 to 1351.
And it seemed to target young adults, didn't it? People in their 20s and 30s. People with a stronger immune system were the ones who were most likely to die because somehow it did something to your immune system that then worked against you.
That's exactly right. No, I'm actually very impressed that you know that. Unlike many of the other diseases that spread, other epidemics that have gotten around, of course, that usually, unfortunately, affect particularly the very young or the very old, and those with weak immune systems, there was a disproportionate impact on those, and we'll call them your strongest years. Young adults in particular had very high mortality. And it's interesting that once again there are a range of reasons that sort of sit behind this. One of them, of course, is the fact that we had World War I, and a lot of people of those ages were huddled together, enabling the disease to effectively infect and evolve through those people. But the effect that you're describing was called a cytokine storm.
A cytokine storm doesn't sound good.
So why is it called the Spanish flu, may I ask?
Well, I do know that it didn't originate in Spain, but there was a perception that it did, which is incorrect. I can't remember why they thought it did originate there.
Very good, very good. And you are spot on. Now, the reason why they thought it originated in Spain was neutral in World War One.
Right.
Other countries that were afflicted by the Spanish flu were not neutral. They were battling it out, so to speak. And their censors got involved and effectively suppressed information regarding the spread of this virus because it would impact on morale at the end of the war, as well as feed into the psyche and plans of the enemy if they know that you're particularly afflicted by this. However, in Spain, they were much freer to talk about things that were affecting the population. And it created the false impression that Spain was, in fact, the epicenter. It is thought, of course, that it actually originated in China in a rare genetic shift of the influenza virus. And it also popped up in Kansas in the US and many other places long before Spain became seen as the epicenter as such. It was incredibly virulent. It affected an estimated 500 million people around the world in 4 successive waves. Estimated deaths from the Spanish flu ranged anywhere from 17 to 50 million and possibly as high as 100 million people worldwide, which is just extraordinary.
Which is far greater. I think 20 million people died in the First World War.
That's correct. Yeah. That's correct. Yes.
So if the war gave rise to it, then the indirect effect of the war means 20 million plus, as you say, anything up to 100 million.
100%.
Casualties of the war, in a way.
100%, Conan. The effect of the epidemic was so severe that the average lifespan in the US dropped by 10 years. Unlike previous flus and other viruses, it was incredibly rapid. You would catch the Spanish flu and drop dead. There are stories, for example, of people wandering down the street catching the flu, and within hours they'd pass away.
Really?
Absolutely horrendous. One anecdote was of 4 women playing bridge together late one night, and then overnight 3 of them died of the flu.
Wow.
But not dissimilar to what we've seen throughout COVID. Public health departments really did engage over this period. They provided gauze masks to be worn and instructed they needed to be worn in public. Funerals were limited to 15 minutes because so many bodies were piling up. Many towns required a signed certificate to enter that town, and trains wouldn't accept passengers without them. So it's interesting. We've seen the response, of course, to vaccination and government-imposed restrictions through the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. Because the Spanish flu came off the back of World War One, where there were already strict rationing, restrictions on people's movements and so on, as well as the evolution of science over that time. Germ theory was really taking off. They were operating on people using wonderful new inventions like antiseptic. People started to accept that. So people would actually take the precautions that government would be instructing them to take. Then over the course of the war, medical science leaped dramatically because, of course, they wanted to treat their wounded soldiers and the diseases that soldiers may have. If the Spanish flu had broken out in similar sort of conditions prior to the war, it probably would have been more devastating. But instead, science had improved so dramatically over that 3 or 4 year period in terms of the treatment and hospitalisation and other things. So how did it end? So over time, those who contracted the virus developed an immunity, no surprise there, and really life returned to normal very quickly. By the early 1920s, everything was kind of back on track as such, and that's the Spanish flu.
Thank you, Chris. Excellent. So, Chris, as I said, the population of the Australian continent at the time Europeans arrived was 200 to 300,000. But the number of Aboriginal people over the last 230, 40 years was at its lowest point just after the First World War due to the Spanish flu, which one of many diseases that affected First Nations people.
Did they have an estimate of that sort of impact?
Yes, but I don't know it.
It's fine.
I have seen a graph, and it shows the population in 1789, and it just sort of over the 240 years, and it just sort of goes down to just it gets really low just after the First World War. and then it's been increasing ever since. So in the late 19th century, European colonists saw the results of introduced diseases on an Aboriginal population and basically decided that they were a dying race. It was that perception that gave rise to various government policies that we've talked about before in the David Unipont episode, the stolen generations, I guess, being the most obvious of those, where
protecting, I say that in inverted commas, Aboriginal people by sending them and corralling them to institutions
it wasn't protecting, it was an attempt to breed them out. Because the perception was anyone who was so-called full blood would die out because they were inherently incapable of surviving in the modern era. Anyone who was of mixed Aboriginal and white blood would be taken away, and then they would be married off, and their genes would be bred out over subsequent generations. So that's why that has been described as a form of genocide too. You're attempting to deliberately, not through murder, but through a different kind of government policy, annihilate a race. So the last smallpox case in Australia was identified during the First World War, so we haven't had it since. There is no cure for smallpox. As I said before, they had that primitive form of vaccination, the variolation, from the early 18th century. It was in 1786, so only 2 years before the first fleet arrived, that there was an English doctor, Edward Jenner. Does that ring a bell?
Yes, it does ring a bell. How dare you make fun of my lack of a memory? It's horrible.
He's widely credited with coming up with a vaccine for smallpox. So he discovered that by infecting people with the relatively innocuous disease called cowpox, that if you were infected with that, you could develop a resistance to smallpox.
The milkmaid story.
Yes, which is a myth, apparently. And the word vaccination comes from the Latin for cow, which is vacus. So the development of more effective vaccines has saved the lives of millions of people, and it's widely thought that Edward Jenner has saved the lives of more people than any other human being. Yeah. Now, smallpox has continued to flourish around the world, particularly in poorer countries that did not have access to the vaccine. So the really good news story, I suppose, to finish things off, is that, as many people probably know, in 1977, the World Health Organization embarked upon a smallpox eradication program, which was completely successful. Smallpox no longer exists in the wild. It's the only disease to have been completely eradicated from the face of the earth, and it's widely held to be the single greatest public health achievement in history. And the chairman of the WHO agency responsible for this was an Australian, a bloke called Professor Frank Fenner. There you are.
Great. I mean, that gives me something to be very proud of, I think, Conan.
Yes. And the virus only exists, as far as we know, in 2 laboratories in the world.
I'm thinking biological weapons labs in the ex-Soviet Union republics.
Yes.
Yep.
Well, Russia. Yes.
Russia, absolutely. And probably the US then.
Yes, correct.
Great. Good to keep holding on to that, just in case they need it.
Well, yes. So, yes, that brings us to the end of smallpox. Yes, as I said, a bit of an unsavoury note, but I suppose I just felt that the story of how many people died in Sydney is not generally part of the curriculum, as far as I know. It's certainly not in my day, when we were taught about the arrival of the First Fleet and the early years of the colony in Sydney. And certainly it came as news to me. There was a distinct possibility that it was a deliberate attempt to eradicate people there. So those two things, the number of people who died, 70% of the Aboriginal population, and the fact that it might have been deliberate. It's a black armband view, Chris, of those early years, but we probably should be aware of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it is a story I am familiar with.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, you knew that? Oh,
for sure. Now, I had an Indigenous teacher in grade 6, and she talked about all of this. She covered all these stories. Yeah, it's probably worth noting as well, on a more positive note, of course, and on vaccination, because I think that smallpox eradication is it's a moonshot. It's an unbelievable achievement. Of course, about 2 weeks ago, we started to vaccinate people for malaria, which is amazing.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, so it's just kicked off, I think, in Uganda, or certainly those parts of Africa around there, which is, another incredible step forward for medical science, as well as, some incredible philanthropy. It's contributed to the development of that vaccine, which is going to save so many lives.
Is that Bill Gates?
Yeah, Bill Gates Foundation, and I suspect others as well.
Yeah.
Anyway, the journey continues, and let's hope we have a win there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Chris, we are now at the end of our 16 episodes. I thought you might be interested to know the 3 most popular episodes.
I'd love to hear that. Thank you, Conan.
Do you want to have a guess?
Okay, I'm going to say our Australia Day, Invasion Day special.
No.
Matthew Flinders?
Yes.
Okay. And Charles Kingsford Smith?
No.
Okay.
No, not so far. I mean, the numbers might change because that was quite recent. The numbers might change. But no, the Wreck of the Batavia.
It's a great episode.
Yes.
That's such a fascinating story.
Yes, so that was one of them, Ronald Ryan. But I think that's just because it was the first episode. I don't think it's necessarily because people were especially fascinated by that topic. But Matthew Flinders is the most popular. Matthew Flinders got 200 downloads. In total, we've had nearly 2,000. Yeah, we can't pretend that it was going to become a worldwide phenomenon.
We just got to give it time, Conan.
Give it time.
Sell more merchandise.
Yes. Well, we've got our mugs.
Put it out there. And I should say, people, listeners, we did have a go at an Instagram account. And I didn't realize how tiring it would be to create content, and Conan certainly didn't. Who actually created all the content? So it was tough. It was extremely tough.
I gave up. I just couldn't be bothered. I was getting 6 hits or whatever.
We're not social media savvy. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I really appreciate what I think is a loyal following that we have in fact gathered over the last year or so. And I know people that listen and send me notes about how much they've enjoyed the podcast, which I think is brilliant. And thank you very much for listening over the last year.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, yeah, nice. So thank you very much, Chris, for collaborating with me on this. It's been a great 14 months. Just sorry, everyone, that we basically have run out of material because I've been repurposing material. And I don't want to spend hours researching it for no money. So I'm a busy man with many demands on me, Chris. And you're very much in the same boat. So that's basically why we've chucked it in.
Busy lives, as we all can appreciate.
Yeah, yes. Good. All right, Chris. Well, thank you. And we can't say until next time. So, yes, thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for listening.